Welcome to this explainer. So, back in June 2026, the world's absolute largest multilateral lender quietly made a massive decision. They completely scrapped their headline climate finance targets. Today, we're breaking down exactly why this happened and what it actually means for the future of global development. This is a monumental shift in international finance, and to understand exactly how it all went down, we are going to look strictly at the data, the statements, and the structural mechanics behind this totally unprecedented move. Let's get into it. All right, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the climate quota getting scrapped. Then, the American pushback. Third, the shift to outcomes. Fourth, the global backlash. And finally, the ripple effect.
Okay, let's jump straight into Chapter 1. The climate quota scrapped.
We're starting with the initial shockwave from late June 2026. I'm talking about the total removal of top-down financial input quotas for climate projects by the world's largest multilateral lender. It's wild how fast this policy shifted, right? Under the initial 2021 Climate Change Action Plan, the World Bank set up a baseline mandate, meaning 35% of all its annual financing had to go toward projects with climate co-benefits. Then, in 2023, that quota was aggressively bumped up to 45%. But fast forward to the summer of 2026, and those rigid financial input quotas were just completely retired. Now, the bank is still extending its overall structural framework beyond 2026 to advise countries on going green, but that absolute ironclad requirement to spend a specific percentage of dollars on climate, that is officially gone.
That brings us to Chapter 2, the American pushback.
Now, to understand why this strict quota was just tossed out, we've got to look at the main catalyst: sustained diplomatic and financial pressure from the United States administration. The U.S. actually possesses incredible mechanical leverage in this space. They hold roughly 16% of the voting power in the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the bank's primary lending arm. Because major policy shifts and capital replenishments require supermajorities from the Board of Executive Directors, that 16% effectively hands the U.S. a veto over the entire institution's direction. And the current U.S. administration used this structural dominance to really align international development finance with its own domestic priorities. At the April 2026 spring meetings, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent came out swinging. He launched this massive critique rooted in traditional economic theory, aggressively arguing that arbitrary green quotas distort how money is naturally allocated. He literally called the targets distortionary and nonsensical. The U.S. perspective is essentially that top-down quotas force the bank's loan officers to prioritize projects just to check a bureaucratic environmental box, rather than funding things that offer the highest immediate return in terms of job creation or GDP growth for a developing nation. And this really gets to the heart of the American argument. The U.S. administration essentially says the bank is suffering from mission creep. They believe the institution needs to focus exclusively on its original post-World War II mandate, which is poverty reduction and macroeconomic stabilization. On top of that, the U.S. forcefully demanded a reversal of the bank's restrictive policies on fossil fuels. Their argument is that developing nations absolutely need access to cheap, abundant baseload power. And yes, that includes gas, oil, and coal if they're going to industrialize and compete globally. To them, denying that energy is an artificial barrier to economic mobility.
All right, moving on to Chapter 3, a shift to outcomes.
Faced with all this intense shareholder leverage, the World Bank didn't frame the change as, caving in. Instead, they called it a necessary institutional evolution under President Ajay Banga's new philosophy of smart development. Basically, the bank successfully transitioned its focus away from measuring bureaucratic dollars spent, which they call inputs, and toward evaluating real-world developmental outcomes. Banga argues that just measuring the percentage of dollars allocated is inherently flawed. Instead, under smart development, the goal is to empower borrowing nations to define their own pathways. Whether that means building flood-resistant roads or integrating drought-resistant seeds, they can do it without the pressure of an arbitrary spending floor.
The big key word here is accountability. Rather than a strict 45% spending mandate, the bank is now relying entirely on its newly refined corporate scorecard to transparently track atmospheric and human impacts. So, they're shifting accountability from the initial loan approval phase to the actual post-deployment reality phase. By tracking net greenhouse gas emissions and the number of human beneficiaries who actually gain enhanced climate resilience, the bank argues it's keeping full transparency. For example, their fiscal year 2025 data tracked 136 million actual beneficiaries achieving enhanced resilience. They say this proves they're still doing the work, they're just measuring it better.
To back up the U.S. demand for technology-neutral energy financing, Bonga pointed to a pretty stark reality: 600 million. As in, 600 million people in Africa remain without foundational electricity access in 2026. He contends that without baseline electrification, delivering functional healthcare or robust education is just impossible. Because of this, the bank stated it must support countries in utilizing all available energy sources within their national plans, everything from solar and wind to gas and nuclear, just to establish a reliable baseload.
Which leads us to Chapter 4, the global backlash.
Now, you can probably guess that a policy shift this massive didn't happen in a vacuum. It provoked immediate, deeply frustrated pushback from European allies and climate-vulnerable nations, exposing a huge multilateral fracture. We basically have three competing worldviews directly clashing here. The U.S. wants unrestricted growth. Europe believes climate disasters directly threaten all prior economic progress, making quotas totally necessary. And the V20, the world's most climate-vulnerable nations, argue that without guaranteed climate finance, their physical infrastructure just gets wiped out, triggering severe sovereign debt crises.
To really grasp the European perspective, just look at what happened during London Climate Action Week. French Development Minister Eleanor Carrot pointed out that literally 150 million Europeans were living under extreme heat advisories at that exact moment. Actually, her own diplomatic transit from Paris to London was severely delayed due to train track issues directly linked to the record-setting heat. For European shareholders, this incredibly frustrating, sweltering delay was just undeniable, real-world proof that climate adaptation requires predictable funding quotas. They lobbied heavily to keep the targets, but ultimately they just lacked the voting density to override the U.S. veto threat.
Meanwhile, you have the V20 coalition. They represent 1.7 billion people in developing nations, who, by the way, account for less than 4% of global GDP. They vehemently argue that poverty reduction and climate action are not competing mandates. To them, they're the exact same thing. Without top-down financing targets, these nations are terrified the World Bank's loan officers will naturally drift back toward traditional, simpler infrastructure projects. This would severely underallocate capital for crucial survival infrastructure, like seawalls and grid resilience. Finally, let's wrap up with Chapter 5, the ripple effect. Let's zoom out for a second. What does this strategic realignment actually mean for global finance? And more importantly, why should this matter to you? Well, because these massive shifts impact global supply chains, international stability, and global climate resilience. The World Bank deploys roughly $115 billion every single year. As the world's largest multilateral development bank, that serves as the foundational baseline for the entire international financial architecture. The policies they set don't just affect their own balance sheets, they signal to the entire global market exactly how risk should be assessed and where capital should flow. Without that dedicated 45% quota, financial analysts are waving a massive red flag. They're warning that hitting the UN's consensus target of $300 billion in annual climate finance is going to be exceedingly difficult now. The global assumption was always that multilateral institutions would source a massive chunk of this $300 billion. By abandoning its 45% baseline, the World Bank is introducing massive systemic volatility into these UN calculations. This essentially shifts the mathematical burden to European donors and private philanthropy to somehow make up the difference. The most immediate casualties of this shift could be these complex international projects that blend public and private money. Think about a major green initiative in a developing nation. Anchoring capital is incredibly critical. In places where sovereign credit ratings are low, the World Bank absorbs the initial risk. This essentially encourages or crowds in private institutional investors like Macquarie in Egypt or Siemens in India to join the effort, when they might have otherwise just stayed on the sidelines. If the bank stops specifically targeting these complex green projects, the flow of private capital into the global south could face a really severe contraction.
And that leaves us staring down a pretty massive looming question. European donors are clearly displeased, and they might actually start redirecting their sovereign capital toward regional alternatives, like the African Development Bank, which is heavily leaning into renewable energy partnerships just to maintain their climate mandates. As capital naturally fragments across the globe, we have to ask, will this new era of smart development and unrestricted energy financing succeed in supercharging poverty reduction? Or are we watching the permanent fragmentation of global development finance at the exact moment unified action is needed most? Keep asking questions and keep learning.